All right, we're ready. So today, John came by because we're going to talk about more of my favorite photographers. So in the 1880s, there were basically two pioneers of the history of motion photography. Muybridge, a British photographer who came to America and worked in California and Pennsylvania and Philadelphia, and Marais, a guy who was a physiologist in France and worked from a very different perspective. Muybridge was a showman. He was a publisher. He was interested in pulp fiction and being the most famous person he could possibly be. Marais worked in obscurity. Hardly anybody knew what he did except for the people that worked with him and his immediate scientific peers. They were aware of one another. Marais didn't really approve of Muybridge, and once Muybridge realized he couldn't get any kind of money or fame out of Marais, he wasn't interested in Marais either. So they worked separately. Both contributed to where motion photography would ultimately go, the early 20th century, modernism, time and space, and the fourth dimension, and all that other good stuff. In my opinion, this guy, Marais, because he was a real scientist, his images were actually more important, but this guy, because he was so popular, his images were disseminated so completely through art schools in the early 1900s that he was more superficially influential. Muybridge was an illustrator. You know, Muybridge made hundreds and hundreds of important pictures and put twice as much energy toward promoting them. Marais was obviously way more important to the philosophical thinking of time and art and the fourth dimension.
I love Don, but have you seen what the Big Lummox has already done? He set it up so one of these photographers is the hero and the other one is the villain. Well, I'm not buying it. Then again, I'm perhaps not the most reliable narrator myself, having a certain sympathy for self-promoters. By the way, have you subscribed to my YouTube channel yet? Anyway, both Eadward Muybridge and Etienne-Jules Marais eventually made sequential photographs that captured movement. Muybridge used a system of multiple cameras, and the step-by-step images would be displayed in a series of separate photographs. Marais was inspired by Muybridge's work, but developed a camera that would shoot multiple images on one photographic plate. He desired a single photograph that would help him measure and analyze motion. Both of these guys were precursors of the movies. Muybridge developed his zoopraxiscope, which projected sequences of images. The zoopraxiscope was really an early movie projector. And Marais' chronophotographic gun, the camera that took multiple shots in quick succession, was a predecessor to the modern movie camera. Let's get back to Don. Both these guys have the initials EM. Any other weird coincidences?
They were born a month apart and died 84 years later within a month of each other. So they were absolute contemporaries.
What was Muybridge like as a kid?
He's born in 1830. His father was an early industrialist, corn, coal, and lumber. Time, sequencing, what these pictures represent, I think was built into this guy's DNA. Because what is really industrialization? But it's the perfection of the process. It's making the process easier and quicker and more profitable. So the story I remember was his father would ride his carriage up north to the forest, see how many trees were serviceable and ready to go south. He'd have a homing pigeon in the bottom of his wagon. He'd write a number on a little piece of paper, strap it to the pigeon's leg, and the pigeon would fly home and say, send 4 ships, send 6 ships. It was the telegraph of its day. So this is what this guy was born into, right? So by the time he's 20 years old, he's ready to venture out onto his own.
At age 20, Don also had ventured out and has his own interesting bird anecdote.
The Muybridge that you're looking at, of the cockatoo, I bought when I was a sophomore in college. I paid $150 for it at a photo gallery. And I told my mother, of course, because every good Italian boy tells his mother everything. And she said to me, you know, Donald, we're not sending you to college to buy $150 photographs.
How about Marai's early days?
Marais, his father was a wine steward in one of the most famous vineyards in the south of France. So he was raised on that middle class to slightly upper middle class level. And when he was a child, he just showed mechanical ability, the term brains in his fingertips. He amused all his kid friends with making little Rube Goldberg contraptions for toys. That's where his love was. But, you know, his parents are going to dominate his life like all people, and his mother wanted him to be a priest, and he definitely didn't go for that. He was not necessarily a pious individual. And his father wanted him to be a doctor. He accommodated his father and went to medical school. After you get your medical license, you take another series of tests to see if you are eligible to be a teacher. And lucky for him, he failed those tests. So he didn't have to do that. He was thrilled.
So around the same time that Marais was studying medicine, Muybridge left home. Where did he go?
He goes to America, to New York, representing a publishing company, selling prints and maps. By 1855, he wants to go west. He likes the whole Wild West energy of it all, the gold rush. He disappears for a while. He's in a terrible carriage accident. And in the mid-1860s, 1862 to 65, he goes back to England. They say he really learned a lot of photography technique there. He only came back to sue the wagon company, of course, to get a chunk of money so he can regain his career. That's what he was about, he was just so driven for success.
There you go again, bad-mouthing Muybridge. Did it occur to you that perhaps there's a reason behind his difficult personality? You're such a durable guy. Look at this. Nothing puts a dent in you.
Let's try that again. See if I can hit my scrotum a second time in a row.
Impervious to physical injury himself, Don glossed over Muybridge's
terrible carriage accident.
As a frail individual, I believe this incident needs more explication, including a reenactment. Arthur P. Shimomura wrote, "What has never been fully appreciated is that Muybridge's life was significantly altered by a neurological injury that he had sustained in 1860. In a stagecoach accident, he was thrown out of the coach, hit his head against a boulder, and was knocked unconscious. Friends and colleagues testified that he exhibited significant personality abnormalities. Prior to his accident, Muybridge was a good businessman, genial and pleasant in nature, but after the accident, he was irritable, eccentric, a risk-taker, and subject to emotional outbursts." So let's keep this personality-altering brain injury in mind if Don continues to be mean to him. Anyway, what was his early photographic career like back in America?
Finds himself in San Francisco, opens up his studio, calls it Helios, these flying wings of light that will photograph anything. And he is an incredibly hardworking, incredibly driven self-promoter, as much as he is a photographer. Really, he's a guy who just wants to be a big shot. Photographs landscapes, he photographs out west, he hooks up with every government contract he can. He's a commercial photographer. Sequencing, got a job from San Francisco. It starts off as a hole in the ground, 13 photographs later, it's a finished building. He had that in mind. He did the most famous panorama of San Francisco, a 360-degree panorama that he laid out perfectly in 9 frames, and it was a huge seller. He does a gig where he works for the government, he goes to South America, goes to Alaska. I mean, he just does anything he can. He had to take a little break from his career because he killed his wife's lover.
Good evening, Major. My name is Muybridge, and here's the answer to the letter you sent my wife.
This guy knew how to get into the newspapers, and I almost believe it was done not just to get rid of the guy, but to get away with killing his wife's lover. He follows the guy home. He knocks on the door. The guy opens the door. He shoots him in the chest. He kills him right there and gets arrested, and the trial ensues. He's one of the earliest people to be acquitted on justifiable homicide for a reason of crime of passion. So he got away with it. And part of the defense was, this guy's crazy. He hangs off the sides of mountains to take photographs. He risks his life to do these stupid, meaningless things. Of course he sees his wife with this man, he's going to go nuts and shoot him, and the jury agreed. So, justifiable homicide. So he had to take a little break from his career for about 8 months, which only made him more popular and even more in demand. And Leland Stanford said, "Get me that man."
So before you tell us the very famous Leland Stanford story, how about Marais' early career?
And just as a 28-year-old started mucking around in a private practice, but because he had this amazing ability to make things, he gravitated toward physiology. It had previously just been a subdivision of anatomy, and it was no big deal. But as microscopes and Louis Pasteur started to become more acknowledged, then physiology started to become more important. And there was a very important president of a school, one of the most famous medical schools in France. His name was Claude Bernard. Claude Bernard saw his skills, hired him, and eventually made him the head of the new physiology department. Brand new thing, and boom, his career was begun. And that's where he started to do all his early experiments on what he called graphic writing, which was supposed to be ways to graph the invisible internal biological functions of the body. And he learned about vascular contraction and relaxation. He invented the first polygraph machine while studying how veins expand and contract. A machine with a stylus made out of wood with a delicate little needle, and the stylus would move with the pulsing of your blood. He figured out how to do that, and then he would strap it to the main muscle of a frog, and as it would contract, the thing would go nuts, and he wanted to know the pressure of horses' hooves when they hit the ground. He invented special shoes that had little prongs in them that when they hit the ground, they would hit an air tube that would shoot a signal or a pulse to a graph, and he would be able to pulse the sequence of the gait and which foot had more pressure than the other foot. And he just found all these ingenious ways. And then after he recorded with a real animal, he would then try to invent a mechanical version. He did it with birds and would hook up his air tubes to these birds that would literally fly and make turns, and he could register how much energy it took to make those turns and to go up and down.
Wow, impressive. It's amazing what a non-brain damaged individual can think up. Now let's go back and hear that Leland Stanford story about Muybridge.
Leland Stanford, governor of California, had a huge racehorse stable and was completely into the science of horses. Leland Stanford has actually seen a book written by Marais. He gets the book and he says, this guy's onto something. There was this huge, like $20,000 bet. The bet was, when a horse is in full gallop, do all four hooves leave the ground? Some people said yes, some people said no. And there was no proof of it. Well, Leland Stanford wanted proof. I'm going to hire a photographer. He hired Muybridge, and Muybridge was a smart guy. And at first it was just a job. And he just did the best he could. They built a special shed for the cameras to be in. They would line up 12 cameras with 12 threads that went from the scene to the camera, and the horse would run through and they'd break the thread and the shutter would go off. And they built a special background that was bright white and angled it for extreme reflection so they would get a pure silhouette and a sharper image. He worked on it 2 years. After 2 years, he gets his first serviceable image. He built a plank, put a sheet of metal on the plank, and then he built another plank, and he put a sheet of metal on the bottom of that plank, and he had them separated a little bit. So when the horse would run over the top, where his hoof would hit, the metal would connect to the metal below, and it was connected to a wire that went to a battery, and it would fire the shutter of the camera. So it was the first manually built electronic shutter. And it worked. Running, trotting, galloping, the whole bit. And in 1878, He's got some really serviceable images. He's really happy about them. He gets permission from Leland Stanford to go to Europe and do a lecture circuit because he's a businessman. There was a popular toy at the time, that thing where you have the disc and there's a little slit opening and you put inside a band of images of somebody doing this, and then you spin it around, and when your eye sees it, because they were just learning about how the retina works and how does the image retain itself with the brain. So Muybridge puts his little horse photographs in there, as well as other kinds of movement drawings, and that's part of his presentation. And then he figured out a way to hook this thing up to what was called a magic lantern, which was like a primitive slide projector that would project images with a backlight source. So somehow he figured out with the moving thing and a mirror and a lens, he was projecting long before the Lumiere brothers made movies, long before Thomas Edison. And he went on a tour of Europe. He was taken like he was a king. He loved it, man. So he sees this motion thing as being potentially big. So he just starts pursuing anybody he could to take the project to the next level. And he gives a show, 1882, in Philadelphia at the Franklin Institute. Of course, Thomas Eakins is there. William Pepper was the president of the University of Pennsylvania at the time. He was a big physical fitness guy. Muybridge knows that there's a market for this stuff among artists, among scientists. So he finally gets here in Philadelphia. He's up there giving his presentation. Thomas Eakins is turned on by it. William Pepper believes it'll help Americans be more intelligently, physically fit. The large medical industry, the amputations and the prostheses that were being made here, they thought they can create much more functioning artificial limbs. So there was this trifecta of people that wanted him here. They come up with $20,000. They build them a studio outside the veterinary clinic in West Philadelphia, and they start carving up animals. And he starts doing his thing. It's not an easy thing to do. He's got to figure all this stuff out. Everybody is losing patience with him. Thomas Eakins says, I don't like the way he's working, and Muybridge perseveres. And he eventually improves his system to such a degree that within 2 years, he's got himself a really workable system. He probably makes as many as 20,000 pictures. 784 end up in sequences of either animals or humans in motion. But what it turns out to be is just pseudoscience, because if a negative was lousy and he found a gesture that he thought was close, he would just drop it right in there. There was no scientific method. And he also was following much more popular trends. There are more pictures of women dressing and undressing than almost anything else as a single subject. Women only were seen sweeping, or again, stark naked smoking cigarettes, or one pouring water into another one who's on her knees, I mean, really salacious subject matter for the Pulp Fiction future. He would do for manual labor. He'd have professional bricklayers and professional carpenters working in front of his cameras to document their processes. All the athletes at Penn, there's great pictures of fencers and wrestlers. And the wrestlers, for example, became one of Francis Bacon's favorite subjects for his paintings in the 1950s. So Muybridge went on to make these pictures. He became such an embarrassment toward the end of the project because it was just, one naked woman throwing a bucket of ice water on another naked woman, and she runs away, and he gets it from 20 different cameras and so on and so forth, that eventually they shut him down, and he moved on to try to sell all the pictures, and that became the rest of his life. He was just trying to market these albums. He was like the popular scientist, whereas Marais, he was the real deal.
Okay, Don. So Muybridge's highlight was these albums of human and animal movement. How about Marais? How did he make those weirdly futuristic photos of movement?
He had the camera that had a moving disc inside. On that disc were 13 different exposures, and as the subject would move, the camera would be cranked, the disc would spin, and when the subject and the negative lined up through the lens, ba-boom, exposure, ba-boom, exposure, ba-boom, exposure. So you made 13 very quick images in succession. He had a specially designed black skin-tight suit with a hood and special boots. And on all the moving parts of the subject, he put a white, bright bar, sewed it onto the outfit, right? He then puts that person in front of a black background. Contrast makes the three-dimensional form disappear, black on black. What does the camera see? Just the white bars that reflect back, almost like a graphed, computered image. But this is in reality a photograph from 1884, 1885. Other pictures by Marais look exactly like nude descending a staircase.
So there you have it. Both these guys are great, but Don prefers Marais for his intellectual rigor and pursuit of scientific knowledge, while thinking that Muybridge is more of a showman and huckster. I like them both, but have great sympathy for Muybridge because of his head injury. And besides, some of his pre-motion study photographs are just incredibly beautiful. We could not have made this movie without these two books. Helios, Eadward Muybridge in a Time of Change, and Picturing Time, the work of Etienne-Jules Marais. Finally, Don made an error in our last film and wants me to read the following. For those who saw the movie at the Barns, I claimed a small Marais with a white background with black lines was a negative print of an actual image. It was not. It was a man-made diagram measured from the actual Marais image. Don and I are also extremely grateful to a plucky band of finger puppets without whose courage the reenactment of the awful stagecoach accident would not have been possible. We want especially to thank finger puppet Claude Monet for performing the role of Eadward Muybridge.